Human beings learn best through stories. Our entire thinking is significantly based on stories, be it stories that we tell to ourselves, to each other, or stories that are being told to us. For the last 120 or 130 years, we've also been telling stories in video format, first without sound, then with sound, then in color, and all the way up to the present day we've gotten better technologically just so we can tell a story better. And the story of, storytelling continues even with the multiple issues that plague the industry these days. One sign of that is precisely the fact that quality has moved away from the traditional cinematography industry and into what is colloquially known as TV shows. So what are the hidden gems for those of us not exactly excited by the introduction of far-left politics into every facet of the culture? Let's explore. Hello everyone and welcome to the Freedom Alternative. Alrighty, so I've been promising for quite some time now that I will recommend some TV shows on the channel. In fact, I think I first mentioned this about 3 years ago. So yeah, it is about high time that I actually do it. The criteria I used to select the shows are as follows. 1, me having seen at least half of that show. 2, the show must have a non-leftist message or some value for those studying propaganda or storytelling. And criterion number 3, provide some form of practical and realistic knowledge or wisdom or wisdom. There is no particular order since the idea is that you'll eventually watch them all if you haven't done so already. I will spill some low-key spoilers because I want to convince you to watch the shows. Besides, I really love spoilers myself and I simply don't understand what's all the fuss about spoilers. So with that said, let us begin. Number 1, Arrow. This is probably the most surprising one on my list, that's why I started with it. Generally, Arrow has a pretty childish outlook, as are almost all superhero type of movies or TV shows, and many peeps who take themselves way too seriously turn up their noses on it. But Arrow is absolutely worth watching, not for its characters or even most of its story, which in my opinion is pretty low quality, but to see in real time the struggle that the script writers went through in trying to keep the show in line with the ever-changing political landscape and failing at it because the story is fundamentally conservative despite the fact that nobody wanted it to be. Keep in mind, the show's first episode aired in 2012, and this year the final season will air. I think it's the final season, who cares? Anyway, the show starts from a pretty social justice-y premise, though I'm sure at least one comic book fan will whine in the comments about my characterization, but it's really a social justice-y premise. The premise is the son of a billionaire who barely survives a boat crash comes back to his hometown to fight evil. Now, the first season is pretty rigorous on the story, but then it becomes full of what SJWs hate the most: white male privilege being used to enact a personal agenda of dubious morality. Whether the viewer agrees with the main character or not, the show, from the second season onwards, makes it pretty clear that none of it would be possible without the accumulated wealth of the main character's parents, as well as his own skirting of the law through his later on revealed past work with various intelligence and espionage services, both private and state actors. Now, by that time in the show, it was already 2015 and economic socialism was at its all-time high in popularity in the bubble of the writers of the show, so the character becomes poor and oppressed, but in order to keep true to the source material and have a reason to keep the show alive, he still succeeds, mostly due to other traits that are politically incorrect when manifested by a white man. such as resilience, stoicism, leadership, and cold blood. So the reason I'm recommending this TV show is so you can observe the struggle of the scriptwriters in trying really, really hard to make the show a left-wing one, and even though they try hard, they still end up with a mostly conservative story. And it's because the only stories worth telling are conservative. At one point, some of the crew that the main character gathers around him separates and builds a wall and makes the city great again. Yeah, totally not political. But even in that circumstance, the former crew that now becomes the villains who build the wall, they turn out to be correct. The method worked and permanently solved the issue of violence and insecurity in the Glades, which is the worst and most dangerous neighborhood in the main character's hometown. In fact, the whole point of the show is the main character's mission to save the city, but particularly the Glades, and it's only accomplished by building a wall, strengthening law enforcement, and curbing immigration. The conclusion of that is not known when I'm taping this video, but the writers really want you to believe that's a bad thing. So yeah, Arrow. Watch it so you can understand a few things about propaganda, in particular, the limits of propaganda, because even the NPCs figured it out that the writers are full of it. Alright, number 2, the 100 or the 100. I've mentioned this show in the past on the channel mostly because something of a rarity occurred. The producer and writer Jason Rothenberg refused to back down under SJW pressure and essentially told them in a very polite and soft-spoken language that they should fuck off from his work. And after that, they should fuck off even further and refused to amend the show's story because of pressures from SJWs. But it's not for the balls of the producer or the temporary balls of the producer that I recommend this show, but because it is remarkably well written. In fact, for this decade, there isn't much competition really. It's just that good. The show starts really low, but it gets really, really good as the seasons progress. The premise is this. An all-out global nuclear holocaust presumably wiped out all of human life on Earth, and the only survivors are the descendants of those who got out in time to live on the Ark, which is an international space station. The action takes place 97 years after the catastrophe and depicts a democratic police state as the form of civilizational organization on the Ark. Almost all crimes are capital crimes, and the punishment being floated into the outer space, with the exception of minors who are sent to jail. The Ark is old and is decaying due to overpopulation, and the democratically elected dictators decide to shoot two birds with one stone. Drop 100 resource-consuming criminal teenagers on Earth and monitor their vital signs, thus finding out whether the Earth is habitable or not. And this is where the genius of the writers first becomes clear, because the depiction of how things work out resembles quite a lot with everything known from human history when applying bad ideas. The kids at first establish their ideology, which is whatever the fuck we want. No, seriously, that's their initial ideology. Lolbertarianism, essentially. Now, their anarcho-whatever dream ends pretty quickly as they find out they're not alone. It turns out it's not that easy to wipe off 100% of humans. Then, throughout the show, there are multiple attempts to create some egalitarian bullshit. And every single time, no exceptions so far, those who are the most social justice-y egalitarian wanting, those die the most brutal deaths. Who survives the longest? The cynical, the circumspect, dare I say the conservative, and generally those aware of their individual worth and skills who engage in managed and limited cooperation rather than kumbaya fantasies. This is what kept me watching, really, because it's realistic. It's how reality works as well. And this is what makes the show impressive. The fact that the writers possess the knowledge and wisdom to tell a story that doesn't require that much suspension of disbelief. This is a show to recommend to everyone, essentially, but especially to young people. It's the best show from this decade to kill off some idealism. Idealism is the main enemy, and this show does an excellent job at showing, oftentimes pretty graphically, how dangerous idealism is and why it should be curbed every step of the way. Essentially, this show is a good illustration of the tragic vision. I don't know whether Jason Rothenberg is a conservative, but it would be even better if he isn't, because it would show once again that the best stories are conservative, even if your own idealism prevents you from agreeing with reality. But no, seriously, for a thorough appraisal of the tragic vision, watch The 100. Of course, the show is made to be youth-oriented, so it has a lot of scenes and moments where one might roll his eyes, but once again, the director does a good job at integrating those into the wider plot, and throughout the show, it is hard to find a moment that is clearly out of place and put in there for political or marketing reasons. Even the main characters flirting with bisexuality fits the plot. You're in Savage Land, so of course in Savage Land basic norms of civilizational decency don't apply. But they do start to apply once civilization is more firmly established. Alright, let's move further because otherwise I'll speak for an hour just about The 100. I have bad things to say about the show too, but in my opinion, those bad things are far outstripped by the positives of the show. Anyway, number 3, The Blacklist. If you like espionage stories, you mustn't miss The Blacklist. Now, the main downside of this show is that it does require comparatively high levels of suspension of disbelief as opposed to person of interest, for instance. I'll talk about that a bit later. The main upside of the show, however, is that you get to learn quite a lot about human nature, particularly the nature of criminals involved in what law enforcement would call organized crime. The show is about the uppermost individuals in the organized crime, where it's really not organized crime anymore, but rather full-fledged private intelligence agencies whose goals happen to differ from those of the powers that be. And I'm describing it this way because throughout the show, the line between legal and illegal and the line between moral and immoral is consistently questioned and blurred, forcing the viewer to ask and ponder upon very nuanced questions. Essentially, it has you think through your positions and eventually makes you understand, if you haven't already, that there are degrees to all things in life and that, in general, things are a lot more complicated than criminal man bad and law enforcement man good. One main reason I suspect you will love this show is the main character, which is throughout the show unclear whether he's a villain or a hero, Raymond Reddington, a character impeccably brought to life by James Spader, an Australian actor, if I recall correctly. Now, I have to say there is no better evidence that the awards industry is thoroughly corrupt than the fact that James Spader still hasn't received a Golden Globe Award for Best Actor. The premise is this. An internationally renowned criminal and traitor, Raymond Reddington, FBI's most wanted man for over 2 decades, suddenly turns himself in, but will only talk to a low-ranking agent called Elizabeth Scott, later on Elizabeth Keene. From a story perspective, the show is quite complex, but still manageable. But what's attractive to it is how well represented are both the flaws and the blessings of human nature in almost all of the characters. And that's what you should be keeping an eye on, because that's the most realistic part of the show, namely that the line between law enforcement and top-tier crime bosses is much thinner than people think, and that criminals come in all sizes, shapes, and forms, and generally it's a lot more complicated than the criminal is evil, end of story, and that oftentimes the criminal might not be. Especially after Season 3, it becomes clear that The Blacklist is not a plea for moral relativism, but a plea for understanding nuance. In fact, most of the show is predicated precisely on the deep sense of morality of the main characters, a sense that often collides with reality, oftentimes in a less than pleasant way. The Blacklist is one of the shows that benefited positively from the current political climate and was arguably prolonged at its darkest hour because of the story involving some Russian collusion. Nevertheless, It's a good thing, in my opinion, that it got renewed in 2017 because the development of the story was totally worth it. There is also a spin-off from the show called The Blacklist Redemption, which I suggest you also watch, even though sadly the spin-off wasn't renewed, largely because it didn't have any Raymond Reddington magic in it. James Spader is what's driving up the audiences, really. His performance is really, really that good. Now, keep in mind that on the concrete things, the show is pure fantasy. A criminal like Raymond Reddington can't exactly exist in the real world. But the show is full of criminals who not only can, but did or do exist in the real world. So pay attention to some of the cases from the list, because many are constructed after legit ones. Now, speaking of realism, the next one might as well be a documentary, number 4, Mr. Robot. This show is both literally and metaphorically a schizophrenic show, and it's precisely because it's a schizophrenic show that makes it so realistic. Basically, this first season is the story from the perspective of schizophrenic hacker Elliot Alderson. I forget the name of the actor, he's some Egyptian guy, pretty famous lately. And then the second season is the same story from the perspective of the neutral viewer. And the difference is striking. So what's the story? Well, basically Alderson is recruited by an anarchist hacktivist group which purported to abolish all consumer debt, and it could do that by ruining E-Corp, oftentimes referred to as the Evil Corp, the most powerful conglomerate in the nation, which holds the title deeds for all properties and debt in the nation. It's a story of revolutionary thinking and what happens when you start a revolution without having the answer of the most important question. The most important question being, and then what? Because the anarchist plan does succeed, and that's when things go really, really bad. The main selling point to the normies for this show is that 100% of the hacking scenes are realistic. You get to see that hacking in real life is nowhere near as spectacular as it is usually portrayed in movies. You might want to take a few hints from the show on privacy issues, by the way, because all of the depictions when it comes to privacy in the show are entirely legit. But the main selling point, in my opinion, is the overall story, which shows the evils of revolutionary thinking and generally portrays pretty accurately what happens when you decide your ideas are so good that they have to be mandatory, and on top of that, you allow yourself to be guided by activists whom you don't scrutinize. My favorite moment in the show is when the hero realizes he was just a pawn in a larger intelligence game that started merely because someone had a personal spat with someone else and wanted to one-up that person. Consequences and costs be damned. Now, I won't reveal too many details because you're pretty spoiler sensitive, so I've heard, but I will say that this show gives a pretty accurate and in-depth depiction of what I mean when I say activists and their useful idiots. So yeah, mandatory viewing for this show. It has 3 seasons, although it was announced that there will be a 4th season, which is a mistake in my opinion, as the first 3 seasons pretty much covered the whole thing. The main downside will be the fact that at times the show seems illogical, but it's because the story starts from the point of view of a schizophrenic. But I assure you, it does get better. Anyway, let's go further. Number 5, Person of Interest. Now, this is a show with a theme you have seen before in movies such as Eagle Eye in 2008 or the 1998 masterpiece Enemy of the State. The difference here is that the story is told neither from the perspective of the state nor from the perspective of the citizen, but from the perspectives of the architects of the overreaching machine and from the perspective of the machine. It's a story about morality. How much surveillance is too much? Who is wise and moral enough to control it? How many checks and balances are enough? Are they ever enough? These are hard questions which the show attempts to portray how the architects got to their response. Spoiler alert, they change their answer multiple times because it's hard. And no matter how complex your mechanism is, reality is even more complicated than that. The show starts as a basic private intelligence type of story, but it gets really complex after season 1, and throughout the show, multiple legitimate hints are thrown about how should one go about his day if one values his privacy. The writing is very well researched, and it shows that the writer had very good consultants. Most of the show is from the perspective, as I said, of the machine and also of the architect. The machine is how the super intelligent AI is called, and from the perspective of the architect, only one of them actually. The other one dies before the show begins, essentially. You should watch this show for the insights on how to maintain or increase your degree of privacy, while something so potent as the machine is unlikely to come up during our lifetimes. The story is placed in present day, so in an all else being the same type of universe, ceteris paribus. And the hints for preserving your privacy are still valid, even though the threat doesn't rise up to that level yet. Although the show does have quite a few insights on how to stay clear of the good old-fashioned corruption as well. After all, you don't need a super intelligent machine to start being concerned about your privacy. Good old corruption, which is a thing everywhere, is a timeless threat that you should keep in mind anyway. So yeah, there are many winks and nods to the privacy freaks out there, which makes sense since the main character, the architect of the machine, is a supremacist in terms of privacy rights who sacrificed even his relationship with the love of his life just to maintain privacy. And I mention this aspect because it's precisely this aspect that gets him into trouble somewhere in the middle of the show, thus showing another aspect. In times of crisis, love is a weakness, a flaw to be exploited. Harsh, I know, but that's how reality works too. Anyway, I'll stop here, though I do have quite a few other shows in mind too. Maybe I'll put those in a part 2 at some point in time. I mean, given that it took me 3 years just to get around to do this part 1, who knows when I'll get around to do part 2. So, what do you all think? Have you seen any of these shows? And if yes, what was or is your take on them? After all, it is art, so there is no one way to interpret it. And you got any shows of your own to recommend? I haven't watched much of anything lately since I've been on the road almost non-stop since February, hence the drop in new videos on this channel. But after the Polish tour ends, which likely takes place as we speak, since I will be scheduling this video to be published while I'm in Poland. So yeah, once I'm done with the Polish tour, then I will have a lot of time in my hands to both make a lot of new videos, to get back to the annual average, and yeah, watch some new shows while the videos render. So yeah, do recommend stuff to me. I promise I'll watch them eventually. Maybe. So with all of that being said, thank you all for watching. Thank you for your consistent and generous support. Please do consider a donation, especially now as I won't end up on the streets in Poland. Don't forget to subscribe to our social media, visit our website, and I will see you all soon on the Freedom Alternative.